This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge Wharton.
And as we continue here at the Future Ready Conference, hosted by the Conference Board here in New York City, we are joined now by Michael Mandel, who is the Chief Economic Strategist for the Progressive Policy Institute. He's also a Senior Fellow at Wharton's Mack Institute in Philadelphia. Great to meet you, and thank you for coming on today.
And great to meet you, too.
Thank you. When you talk about the term Future Ready for Progressive Policy Institute, where do you see it most applying?
Well, future ready in this case means is the workforce ready for the future? Are companies ready for the future? And are regulators ready for the future? So everybody has to have a vision of what's going to happen and work towards that.
I think from the regulatory side, that may be one of the more interesting areas right now, because it seems like, especially when you're talking about the issues around social media, the internet and such, that the regulatory, the people in Capitol Hill and Washington don't feel like they are as ready as they probably should be.
The regulators, the politicians, the policymakers are all trying to get their arms around what the problems are. And and I'm sympathetic with them, because in many of these cases, even the thinkers, the intellectuals, have not really pinned down how these new technologies affect the economy, how they affect people, and we're operating in unknown areas.
Is it also partly because in those instances, the technology and elements around it feel like they are changing almost every day at this point?
Actually, I don't think that that's the problem so much. I think that in many cases, and I'm not just talking about social media, I'm including areas like e-commerce, digital manufacturing, cross-border trade, cross-border digital trade, innovation in pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of different areas where we know what directions the innovations are heading in. We don't quite know what form they're going to take, and we don't know how they're going to play out, because innovation is fundamentally unpredictable. And that's the issue that all of us have, is that we can work out scenarios in our head, but then when they actually play out, it may be very different.
But for some companies, it probably, that concern plays into the level of investment that they are going to make in a particular area.
You have to make it for companies making investment decisions. In some cases, they have to be making these investment decisions without full information, either about the technology or about the regulation. There's some types of regulation where it almost feels like a wrestling match, and net neutrality, for example, is one of those. Where you have, is it going to be strict? Is it going to be weak? And in that case, everybody knows what the parameters are, and you're wrestling about the exact place we're going to land. Right. Privacy is more difficult. Cross-border data flows is more difficult. And then how do you sort of deal with the fact that a lot of these companies operate in not just in the US, but in Europe with a different set of rules, in Asia with a different set of rules? How can they make this all cohere?
Well, and I think that's a question that a lot of people are, if you're really looking ahead now, is whether or not we need to have some sort of unison on a lot of these rules, especially around digital, around the internet, about privacy moving forward. Get everybody kind of under one umbrella, because digital and trade is a global point.
Actually, I'd argue the exact opposite.
Okay.
Right at this point, we are running this giant national experiment where Europe has adopted the GDPR.
Yep.
They just went ahead and adopted it. They didn't test it out first. They said, we think this is going to be better. The U.S. we're doing our thing, which is that we're working towards privacy rules. We're working towards rules about digital ethics. And then Asia, especially China, is doing something else completely different. Right. We're going to get a chance to see which one of these works better.
Right.
It's only because, if you think about it, when you're operating in unknown territory, and this is a little bit like venture capital applied to regulation, what venture capital does is it funds a lot of different startups doing a lot of different technologies, and it lets the market decide which one's going to win.
Right.
In this case, that's where we are as well. We've got Europe. Now, this is why I'd rather not see U.S. states adopting European-type regulations yet until we start seeing how it plays out.
Right.
Give it a year. Give it 2 years till you see, does Europe start thinking that they've made a mistake, or do they like what the results are?
Right. So do you think then at some point that having these different tests going on in different parts of the world will lead us 30 years, 50 years down the road to something that comes together, or are we in a better state of having different sets of rules in different parts of the world?
Well, I think that, the point that you made about fast innovation is a really interesting one, because as digitization moves into the physical industries, like manufacturing, like healthcare, like agriculture, all sorts of new issues are going to arise.
Right.
So we shouldn't believe that the world that we're in, the social media issues, is the be-all or end-all of our problems or our pluses.
Right.
Because in many ways, we talk about self-driving cars, for example. They're not here yet, autonomous vehicles. But when they start operating, they will actually bring a whole different set of issues.
Right.
And I'm a real firm believer that you don't need to jump the gun on regulation. Preemptive regulation doesn't make a lot of sense.
You're listening to Knowledge at Wharton here in New York City at the Conference Board's Future Ready Organization Conference. We're joined by Michael Mandel of the Progressive Policy Institute, who was also a senior fellow at the Wharton School's Mack Institute. So you gave the example of agriculture. And let me touch on that for a second, because we're starting to see more and more technology kind of work its way into the ag sector right now. Yet it's also an industry which is still, at least in the United States, struggling financially in many cases because of a variety of issues. People talk about the impact of climate change. Obviously, in many cases, farmers don't have the resources unless they are part of a bigger organization to be able to make that investment. So how does an entity like agriculture build and develop moving forward with all these different changes coming up when you have some of these factors playing against it as well?
That's a great question. And really, there's an important role for government to help facilitate the adoption of technology at the local level in areas like agriculture and areas like manufacturing.
Right.
Because if you have an agricultural industry, you want to make sure that the farmers are exposed to the technology, they have enough funding to access it, so they can move forward. But you're also going to have startups in agriculture with very different business models. And I think that people have to put their hands around that the world 10 years from now, 15 years from now, in these physical industries may look very different.
What is the expectation then that you tell organizations and companies about how they should view their mindset about thinking long-term, thinking future, but also in some cases they have to think short-term, especially if they're a publicly traded company?
If you think, let's think in terms of manufacturing, where I've been doing a lot of work on digital manufacturing.
Right.
A lot of manufacturers, small and medium-sized manufacturers, have been unwilling to start investing in digitization because it's too expensive, because it means giving up control. But in fact, what's going to happen is that if they don't do that, they run the risk of being left behind. So for them, it's a really difficult decision. Companies that went in too early found themselves not in a great place. Mm-hmm. If you were too late, also not in a great place. So, smart management requires, can you jump on the wave just as it's starting?
Would you consider the auto industry to be one of those areas that is going to face that type of question moving forward?
Oh, the auto industry is well down the road on that, right? Because we have the example of Tesla, a new auto company that got started, but nobody knows whether they can be profitable in the long term yet.
Right.
So everybody's looking to see, does that model actually work? Same thing in e-commerce. For a long time, the conventional retailers stepped back, watched Amazon, and said, Amazon can't make money doing this.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, Amazon is not only making money, but also hiring hundreds and thousands of workers, which is astounding. So in a world in which roboticization was supposed to get rid of jobs, it really turns out that the robots in this case create jobs.
Well, Amazon is probably the greatest example of an organization that is future ready 10 years ago with the way they have developed their pattern.
What they've done is they've been very incremental about investment in data. And so they've been very focused, for example, in building up their e-commerce fulfillment centers. They focused, how can they make it better? How can they make it a little bit better? How can they make it a little bit better? How can they use the data to improve the quality of the outcome for the consumers and for their sellers? And it worked out well.
Using the example of Tesla for a second that you did, Tesla's a unique company in that Elon Musk obviously also has other elements to his organization. He has other elements, the battery build out, SpaceX. There are other elements that he believes can be beneficial to Tesla moving forward with some of that technology.
You think about him as an old-time industrialist. Okay, what he's doing is he's building a pattern of working rather than a particular product, and testing it at scale. What I view the next stage of the information revolution as being the transformation of these physical industries. For 100 years in the auto sector, things were basically done the same.
Right.
And now they're being done differently. You have to see, is this going to work? And you look down the road, you say, how do we do clothing? How do we make clothing? How do we make furniture?
Yeah.
What can we make now that used to be too expensive to make on a mass market basis?
A lot of people are calling this the next revolution. Do you agree with that?
Industry 4.0. Now, that term Industry 4.0 was actually a marketing slogan done by a German ministry. So we're in this interesting middle period where people mouth the words, but they don't really believe it yet.
Right.
But in fact, that's what it's going to turn out to be, because manufacturing, despite what everybody thinks, has actually been a slow productivity growth industry in recent years,
right.
Which is why we've had so many imports from China. What's going to happen is that as we invest in digitalization, we will actually see the growth of factories in places where they left, in new areas, distributed around the country. It'll be a very different geographic footprint, so it won't simply be an industrial revolution, it's going to be a geographic revolution as well.
Well, I'm not old enough to remember it, but a lot of people talk about the post-World War II era and the growth of manufacturing in that period of time. Are you talking about something similar to that, but more on the digital side?
I'm talking about the ability to sort of build, to have factories on a local level that can manufacture a variety of things using digital techniques, customize on a local level, and do this in a way that's competitive with foreign manufacturers. And the technology is there at this point. It's just a question of what can you do in terms of making the business model work. And so we've done a lot of work on digital manufacturing, both in the US and also in countries like India.
Right.
And it could very well be that the Chinese model, which is massive scale, may not work on the next round.
So you bring up India, and obviously a lot of people say that India is this next great area of growth. And obviously there are some other areas around the world that are still developing in many areas that would like to see that type of growth. Are those the areas also that can benefit from this type of change?
There's an enormous potential, because the last 20 years has been about concentrating the production and also transportation in a relatively small number of locations.
Look, worrying about the bottom line and making it tight too.
Well, it's also we would have giant factories where you put into giant containers, shipped to giant stores.
Right.
And then people would sort of come to the giant stores and pull things out of piles, basically.
Right.
This has been the model. And the next model is going to be, Amazon is showing the way, which is that we'll have smaller factories closer to people, less impact on global warming, because a lot of the transportation is very CO2, greenhouse gas intensive. And we will be able to make things for people on a custom basis that is not possible to make now.
So that would lead me to believe that this concern that a lot of jobs are going to be lost in this new digital world that we are, if we're having all of these localized areas of manufacturing, that those concerns may not be as significant as a lot of people would believe.
Think about it. For example, e-commerce was supposed to destroy jobs, and what it ended up doing was creating jobs. If you look right now at the forecasts for that the BLS just put out for the next 10 years, they show the number of truck drivers rising and not falling.
Yeah.
Everything, there's nothing about the current economy that talks about destruction of jobs. Okay?
Yeah.
It isn't happening. What's happening is that there's different jobs being created than we expect. And if we circle around to the question of regulation, okay, and what policymakers can do and what companies can do, it's almost like there's so many opportunities out there. The question is, can you find the opportunities that work for you, that work for the workforce, and make sure everything's connected? Remember, what companies are complaining about the most these days is that they can't find the talent that they need.
Right.
They're not complaining that, how do I get rid of all these workers? They're saying that I've got a problem. The problem is talent. The problem is getting the right people.
So how important then do you see having a conference like this, especially right now? And I would think that this is the type of conference that we are going to see replicated in a lot of different areas and maybe a lot of different sectors as well because of these shifts that you're talking about.
This is a great conference. It brings together people who know what they're doing, who know what they're talking about, and it's a conversation. It's not a one-way, people with the answer telling everybody else what the answer is. It's a conversation about what the future is so that everybody can move forward. Because, do we know what's happening?
Right.
No, there's a lot of uncertainty.
We're joined here by Michael Mandel of the Progressive Policy Institute, who is also a senior fellow at the Wharton School in Philadelphia. You're listening to Knowledge at Wharton here on Sirius XM 132 Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School. So you are, from everything you have said in the last 20 minutes, you are very upbeat and positive and hopeful as to where we are heading, especially with manufacturing.
Absolutely. I think that we can think of the last 20 years as being really strong for digital industries and really weak for physical industries. And that's what's really determined the pattern of growth in this country, which is that areas that were digitally intensive, like the cities, have done well. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the outlying areas have been left behind because, to be honest, manufacturing has not done well. And it's not simply because of outsourcing, it's because of a lack of investment in digitization. Now what's going to happen as the impact of the information revolution spreads to the physical industries, we're going to see gains in places where we didn't expect it. We're going to see new transformation and the ability to do things that were impossible before. I'll just give you a really simple example, and this is actually not something we've just seen this whole series of Marvel movies about the Avengers.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
And we've seen Iron Man armor put up on the screen.
Yeah.
A big, great achievement. But we can put it up on the screen. We can't build it yet.
Right.
We can't, it doesn't, the pieces of that don't, 5 years or 10 years from now, the pieces of that are going to exist. Okay. And so we're looking at a world in which the things that we will be able to do will be vastly increased. Prices will be down.
Right.
And in some sense, we will get more disruption, but also more growth.
Great meeting you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Great conversation. Thank you for your time. And I look forward to seeing you back on campus at some point. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Michael Mandel, who is a Chief Economic Strategist for the Progressive Policy Institute and a senior fellow at Wharton's Mack Institute.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.